Thanks to you and Verisoft and Mark for inviting me as well to be the moderator. It's an honor to be here with everybody today. We have a great panel. We're in the clouds to discuss the clouds apparently today, so this is exciting. Quick show of hands. How many of you currently have any applications or systems in the cloud? How about half your systems in the cloud? Every system in the cloud? Every application? A couple. How about I don't know if I'm in the cloud? There's always one, but. So during our planning call, we figured out as a team that this is quite a broad subject matter and decided to break it up into two different sections. The first one that we're going to talk about is, this panel one is mostly going to discuss the integration, sort of the impact to your firm, mapping out the business processes and the cloud readiness. The second panel that will step up in about a half hour is going to mostly focus on the security and compliance aspects of the cloud. But for now, to introduce the panel, we have first Mark Capobianco, Executive Vice President, Financial Services of Thrive. Verity Larson, the founder and CEO of Verisoft, visiting from Portland, Oregon. Sorry, I missed you, Melissa Matheson, COO, CCO of Prio Wealth right here in Boston. And Chris Moore, the VP Solutions Architect at Thrive, an expert on the cloud. So with that, I think it'd be helpful if we started off with Chris, since he is our expert. And could you give us a quick overview, high level, of what the cloud is and sort of, high level option, what is the private versus public that we hear about?
Absolutely, thank you very much. So as you begin to think about moving to the cloud or continue your journey to further out into the cloud, or as you're talking with folks that you know that may already be in the cloud, one thing to keep in mind is that everybody has a different definition in their own head of what the cloud is, and there isn't really a standard way that everybody from conversation to conversation talks about the cloud. One of the easiest ways to think of the cloud is to really put them into 4 different buckets and think about it in terms of who's responsible for what in the cloud. So there's a fairly common nomenclature of the shared responsibility model when talking about the cloud. I like to bring in examples that don't involve any technology when I try to talk to people about the cloud. So if we look at this slide up here right now, anything that's in blue is the responsibility of the customer. Anything that's in gray is the responsibility of the cloud hosting provider. On the right are all of the high-level areas that need to be addressed in order to secure and make sure that your data and applications that live in the cloud are highly available. The 4 columns in the middle, the far left one you'll see is a whole lot of blue. That's like owning a house. Everything that goes wrong with the house, everything that needs to be maintained, any improvements, any of the things that exist within the house are secured by the homeowner. So this is very similar to your servers that live in your offices today. But when we talk about the cloud, you can have an on-premise private cloud. So you go out, you buy all the gear, you buy all the software, you secure it, you back it up, potentially provide a disaster recovery environment for it. As you progress kind of out into the public cloud journey, we start to get over into the infrastructure as a service column. I like to say that's more like living in a condo. You still have to maintain the inside, but now somebody's helping you with some of the stuff on the outside. So in the infrastructure as a service, you have providers like Thrive who have their own multi-tenant private cloud with 5 data centers geographically dispersed where we can run your servers and make sure they're backed up and also provide disaster recovery if needed. But then you also get into the hyperscalers, Microsoft Azure, Amazon AWS, Google GCP, to name a few. As you continue over into the platform as a service providers in the cloud, you're now moving into an apartment. You have even less to worry about. but the department is taking care of those crucial things to keep everything running. As an example, if you had a SQL database that you wanted to, move up into the cloud and have somebody take care of all the SQL database administration, then, Amazon and Microsoft Azure, for examples, have platform as a services to deliver those particular products. And as we move into the last category of cloud, you're now moving into a hotel. You have a lot less to worry about, except for yourself, which is really getting in and out, so the security in and out, and the data, yourself to get in and out of that room. So when we get over into the SaaS providers of the world, think Salesforce, think Office 365, think Google G Suite, where you're, for a monthly fee, getting everything you need from the licensing and somebody running all the hardware in the background in order to support that type of cloud. So at a very high, very quick level, that's the cloud.
That's helpful. So what applications move into that hotel and into the cloud, Barry? You're kind of the expert in that regard. What are you seeing firms in financial services prioritizing?
Yeah, so a few items you already mentioned are, of course, things like Office 365, just your basic Word, Excel, even Exchange being hosted or in the cloud through that type of provider. But that obviously is not unique to this industry, of course, that all of you belong to. What you're probably looking more so is at portfolio accounting or portfolio management systems, your OMS or rebalancer tools. You're looking at things like a CRM, maybe even some analytics applications. And what are some of those applications that exist? If you're looking at portfolio management systems, that can be anything from a Tamarack to Orion to Adapar, Black Diamond. All of these are cloud-based applications. There's FinFolio, and there's dozens of them out there. And all of these are applications that are accessed via a website. So really just launch your browser window, go to that website, and that is your entire application through the internet service that you have. Of course, we also then have your OMS platforms if you're talking about needing just a rebalancing tool like Red Black, or maybe you're looking at something that has more specific functionality with regards to trading individual securities. You might be talking about Blaze. Some of the other systems like Tamarack actually have their own rebalancer included, or they do integrate with something like FixFlyer for their more rounded OMS capabilities. And then on the CRM front, of course, everybody's pretty familiar with Salesforce or Dynamics for Microsoft. And then if you're talking about wanting to customize those type of applications, you obviously have different overlays that are available. So I typically recommend, if you're looking at a Salesforce or Dynamics platform, that you look at not customizing it yourself out of the box, but use somebody like a Salentica, Accelerate. Even Salesforce has its own like financial services overlay, something that already has customized for the investment management world that allows you to include the portfolio type of characteristics, account information, whether it's transactions, performance, all that type of information, so you can look more holistically at your business within that CRM application.
That's great. So, Melissa, as the user on the panel, what were your considerations when you guys decided to move to the cloud? What prompted you? You had a number of applications you were talking about.
Yeah, so we moved pretty much everything, but in different manners. So we moved portfolio management and accounting to a fully hosted solution. We moved CRM, fully hosted solution, to a SaaS model, just to reiterate what you're saying. We moved our document management system. Sorry, we didn't have a document management system. It was on a file drive, and we moved that to a private cloud with Thrive. We will probably move QuickBooks to a private cloud. There's certain levels of data that I sort of don't feel comfortable moving to public clouds. And I think we could go into that in further discussions about business risk and business continuity. But I sort of classify the level of the data in which is hosted in each solution and then make a determination of what cloud they should be on. What else did we do? Oh, OMS, on-prem to SaaS model. So, and fully everything about our compliance program is also on a SaaS model as well.
And what were your biggest considerations when moving each different piece?
So the considerations beyond just the level of data, the security of the data. There were some contracts that were signed prior to my arrival, so therefore it was just simply implementing what was signed upon. But subsequent applications, I then would determine if it was going to increase operational efficiency in the firm. It would allow us to be more independent and have better business continuity. And I think part of that is that I really had to understand starting to understand the entire network and infrastructure, as I really had to have IT sort of scope out, what does our current infrastructure look like? And if you don't know how to do that, then you can simply ask your IT provider to do that for you. And the next step upon that, and making the consideration of what cloud to go to, would be then to look at your data mapping. How does the data flow from one application in its current environment, and then where can you improve upon it? And so there's a lot of different considerations.
Is Brio starting to see any benefit from this so far?
We are. I think so. So we're definitely seeing some process efficiency. We were at the end of life on many of our on-prem applications, which were simply breaking down because we did not renew service plans, because we knew on our strategic roadmap which is also important, having a strategic technology roadmap, that we would be decommissioning servers and applications at given times, and we would be doing, just getting more and more efficient with the new technology that we were implementing.
Right. So you touch on there's cost savings that long term start seeing them. So what were there, Chris? You were talking about this on our call. What is the cost of the cloud, because it's far beyond just moving every system. What are the questions that everybody in the room should be asking when trying to compare system to cloud?
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is you're most of the time moving from a CapEx model over to the OpEx model. So the cost isn't always going to be as easy as an apple to compare, because there's a lot of things going into what you're getting out of, say, a SaaS provider versus an infrastructure as a service provider. And you're probably going to end up with some mix of SaaS and infrastructure as a service, and then potentially, maybe even depending on the application, on-premises as well. So, what you should be asking really comes down to, how much does it cost for me to scale? How much does it cost for me to add users? What types of business continuity are included with the solution? What types of disaster recovery are included with the solution? To make sure that in a worst case scenario, you're as protected as you are today.
Something. So when you, to the cost point, I also want to talk a little bit more about that apples to apples comparison, because think about it, if you're going to be moving your portfolio accounting / management system into a SaaS-based model. Right now you probably have an on-prem, so you're talking about hardware, IT resources, handling that. But also, it's not just the licenses of that software, but it's possibly the market data that you're having to pay extra for. You're probably paying for custodian data through a service provider. And there's just kind of all these additional added costs that you may not necessarily think about. It's not just the license of that software. It may be ongoing maintenance, it's support, all that added on. So, making sure that you consider all of the components that make up your total cost of ownership.
Yeah, and there's also the IT costs that are going to go up. You might need a point-to-point connection, basically, and increase your ISP lines and have redundancy in ISP lines. And depending if you are on the public cloud, you're going to have to pay for extra data storage. Just like on your phone, when you move your phone in your photos and you run out of storage, you're going to have to increase that. So there is IT costs, I'll call it, essentially, with moving to a fully hosted solution and infrastructure.
So what are the pros and cons, I guess, Verity?
Well, to your point about the CapEx, you're moving, it's becoming more of a, you're leasing a car versus, owning your car, essentially, and it's not, well, there is depreciation, and I'm not going to get into the accounting of it all. But you're basically moving the line item from your CapEx side on your balance sheet to your operating expenses. So I don't know if that's a plus or a minus, but it's a difference. So.
Yeah, I think pros and cons obviously can be disaster recovery. So that's one that was already mentioned. But I think there's even pros and cons on the DR side. Not just being cloud-based means everything's solved for you and it's easy then for a turnaround. There actually are disaster recovery scenarios where, what if you don't have internet access? What do you do now? And not to say that that happens often, but it does happen. So if you are fully cloud-based, what do you do in that scenario? That in itself is a disaster to account for. Other pros and cons. I think a pro is typically you are getting more updated software on a regular basis. You're no longer having to pay for any additional upgrade costs. It's just all included. You are simply getting the rolled out new features, as they are released to the general public. So it allows you to be more up to date, which is definitely very beneficial.
Except when you use Microsoft.
Yes.
To add to some of the pros, I think a lot of our customers who've moved to the cloud, one of probably the biggest things that I hear is just the ubiquity of it, the pervasiveness of just, I can get to my data anywhere, which is great. So I don't have to worry about jumping through a lot of hoops to do VPNs back in my office. I have the convenience of getting to my data no matter where I am. The other kind of nice things about through the cloud models are it's device agnostic, and kind of the world we're living in today, whether I have my iPhone, my iPad, a Surface, a laptop, I want to be able to see my data and get into my systems. And a lot of the cloud providers have that kind of device agnostic. Whatever screen I have in front of me, I can easily get into that data. So I think that's another good point. Scalability, when you think about having your infrastructure in-house, and now all of a sudden we need to add something else or we need to add more storage, there's typically a CapEx cost with doing that. When you're in a cloud provider, it's pretty easy to scale that solution. So if we need more storage, we can allocate that storage pretty much on the fly. That also helps with time to market. So if you do need to turn something around pretty quickly, whether it's adding more resources to a particular platform, whether that's hardware, CPU and memory resources, or storage, very easy to do that. So time to market is another one. On the connectivity point, excellent point Verity brought up, as well as Melissa, on making sure that you have redundant internet connections. So as soon as we take our data that is sitting right next to me and I move it into the cloud, it's important that we're able to still get to that. So redundant connectivity is important. One thing that we advise our clients on is it's easy to order a Comcast broadband connection and it's like 400 megabytes down, but then it's only like 10 megabytes up. So that's great for like binge watching your favorite Netflix, but when you're looking at a lot of these financial applications, we want to make sure that that bandwidth is symmetrical, because it's very, we want that bandwidth to be predictable, and a lot of these applications are latency sensitive. So when we kind of look at some of the disadvantages of the cloud, we think about, is there going to be a performance penalty if I take my trading system and move it to the cloud? And making sure that we have the right connectivity solution that offers that symmetrical bandwidth is important as well.
That's great. So Verity, do you have any sort of client case studies that you talked about a few different ones, but do you have one you might share with the room overall experience?
Yes. So actually, it's interesting. Over the last probably month, I've had a number of clients doing some DR testing. So they are hosted. So servers are not in their office, but they're hosted, and typically they're accessing their applications via Citrix. And so they've been doing some DR testing and trying to roll over to those environments, make sure they can access everything and everything works properly. And admittedly, every single one has had issues. So needless to say, make sure you're testing your DR plans. Not to say that they're not, you can't work through them, they all have, but it's, definitely a good practice. One, I think, success story that I did hear a few weeks ago at the users group meeting here in Boston. It was actually a user that uses Office 365, Exchange, they use Adapar for their portfolio management system, and I forgot a few other applications. They actually came in to their office Friday morning, and there had been a fire 2 stories above in their office building. And of course the sprinklers came on, fire department came in, threw a whole bunch of water down, and through 2 stories, basically the ceiling and the floors came down and just destroyed their entire office. Computers, everything is destroyed. Friday morning, come in, and that's what they walk into. They worked over the weekend, basically went to Best Buy or whatever local stores they had, bought a bunch of laptops and other computers, found, fortunately, an open office space, and Monday morning they were up and running business as usual. And that was simply because everything they do is in the cloud. So that disaster recovery, concept, while yes, you do need to consider the access remotely, it's also what happens if your office is destroyed and you need to go to a different location. How easy is it for that switch to happen?
So Mark, do you have anything on the opposite side? Any stories of maybe the downside?
Downside in terms of cloud?
Or challenge?
I think the number one reason I hear in the hesitation is really just around data loss, data breach, and data security. And they're probably 86% firms like yourself, the number one reason why they're not moving to the cloud is because of data security and data breach. Spoiler alert, we're going to talk about that in the next panel. But to just pivot on something that Melissa said is, she said something that was very interesting, which is, she mentioned the word data classification. And I think that's so important. It has to start with the data. You have to look at your data, look at what type of data that is, and then really being able to figure out where does that move. And it isn't a one-size-fits-all. It could be, maybe some of it is software as a service. We don't talk so control is a big one. There are some people, I'd like to have my data, I like to see it, I like to see the flashing lights. So kind of losing some of that control is a hesitation for folks as well. But I think really looking at your data, the type of data that you're moving, and then making sure it's in the right model. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the second session.
It's a great segue. Unfortunately, we need to hold questions until the end, just given our time frame. If we do run out of time at the end for questions, Thrive and Verisoft will be sticking around for some time over it for coffee and dessert as well. So at this point, let me ask Melissa and Chris to step down and. So the second piece of our panel is really focusing on the security and compliance side of things. And Mark just asked about how many of you in the room, and this is a big one, how many of you are concerned about security in the cloud? Probably the number one, yeah, all of us are. So that's why this panel is assembled, and we're going to talk about a number of different things. But let me introduce Chip Gibbons is added to our panel. He is the Director of Cybersecurity at Thrive, expert on everything. I think we've all seen his emails, and he's been sending a lot out recently. And then Daniela McRitchie from Howling Capital. She's joining us as our user to talk about the different compliance and security concerns that she's dealt with and gone through at her firm. So Chip, why don't we start with you to give us sort of another overview of the security concerns for firms like ours in the room, financial services.
Great. So financial services, Sorry about that. Is that better? Okay. So financial services firms, as you guys are all very well aware, have a lot of regulation that you have to be compliant with, right? And this, we're talking about compliance and security, so there's somewhat two different things, right? Just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're secure, and just because you're secure, it doesn't mean at all that you're compliant, right? So as you go through it, and we talk about the cloud, and we're talking about email, because email is very easy for most people to understand. When you had an email on-premise server 5-10 years ago, and maybe you still have it now, you had all this hardware you had to maintain, you had to patch it, and make sure the OS was up to date, you had to reboot these things and hope to God it'd come back, right? And if it went down, that was always a problem, right? When you start moving to the cloud, those problems kind of go away, right? The patching it happens magically in the back end. While Microsoft does go down once in a while, it's probably a lot less frequently than it happened when you were doing it on site, right? So if you look at this graph over here, everything in the orange is what you used to maintain when you were on premises with an email server. When you go to Office 365, you don't do that anymore. That's all with Microsoft. But the stuff on top is still there. And one of the things I really like talking about people in the financial services industry is because they understand risk, right? Most people don't talk about risk, or they think it's either a yes or a no. Well, risk is a gradation of grayness, right? So when you're in the cloud, your risk doesn't go away, it just changes, right? So as some of you might know, the biggest risk for everybody for Office 365 or any email is an account takeover, right? So we see this all the time. Somebody clicks on a link, they get phished, they have spring 2019 exclamation point as the password, and they get hacked, and they get their password, taken over, their email taken over, right? That has nothing to do with the cloud, or if it's on-premise or it's the cloud. It's just because the policies and procedures weren't in place, right? So as we start talking about in this panel tonight, or today, we're going to talk about compliance and policies and procedures. They don't always change when you move to the cloud. Some of them do, some of the risks change, but you have to kind of migrate with it. But as we move to the cloud, a lot of things do stay the same. And as we talk about some of the experiences people have, we'll understand a little bit more of the risks that you guys face as you go with that, or some of the risks that you take away, like taking away the patching and the downtime that you might have had before.
That's great. So let's talk about some of those risks. And Daniela, as our user on the panel, can you talk about your concerns when you were moving to the cloud and the applications that you have in the cloud?
Sure. So we are mostly all in the cloud, except for our main server where our internal files sit. But for everything else, we're mostly in the cloud. And it does take a while. It took us we're still not all the way there, and it's taken us over 3 years. Thanks to Mark, we were able to get there a little faster than I think we all thought we would, but it still takes a very long time, so it's not something that will just happen overnight. We definitely staged how we moved to the cloud, so we did a risk matrix and identified all of our vendors and what information they had. And then based on that risk matrix, we then decided, okay, which ones were we comfortable with moving to the cloud, and then which ones did we still want to keep on premise. So that's kind of how we rolled out into the cloud. I think some of the things that were a key component of us moving to cloud is we are looking to have people work from wherever they are. We have a lot of people traveling lately, we have people working from home, so we were looking at it as it's a lot easier to access all of these systems from anywhere if it's in the cloud, than as opposed to having it on a hard drive or server in our office and then having to VPN into that server. So our portfolio accounting system previously, we were actually on a trust accounting system that was in a server in-house, and as a user that works from home a couple days a week, it was always very slow and clunky. So once we moved to our new portfolio accounting system that's in the cloud, it's now seamless. I VPN into my desktop and I don't even know the difference that I'm not in the office. So I think being able to work from wherever we are has been a huge benefit for us on why we decided to kind of make that move.
And as management, what were the biggest security concerns that you had to address and sort of get over? Sort of everyone in the room raises their hand, so you had those conversations.
We did. We had them over and over again. And I think part of it is obviously, the risk matrix helped a lot, and we were able to then reach out to each vendor when we were going to be moving, and we did. We asked them for their SOC reports, their SSA 16s. I had no idea what they meant, and luckily we were able to send them to Mark to look at. And then we had everyone sign a non-disclosure agreement and really dug into what their disaster recovery looked like. And that was the thing that I think we really tried to dig into the most, was if there was an incident or disaster recovery at the provider's cloud, what would happen? And once we felt comfortable with those answers and were able to portray that to management, it was a lot easier to get them to buy in. The reports are great to have on hand and you need them, but I think it's more looking at the disaster recovery, business continuity, and incident response. If there's a breach, what happens? Because that's more real life.
And how did that impact your incident response plan, your overall business continuity? Better?
So we were
Easier?
asking for all these people to give us their incident response, and we didn't have one ourselves. So it really drove us to then create an incident response plan internally, because if we had a breach, we did not essentially have a plan of action. We knew what we would have to do from the top for immediate action, but beyond that, we didn't really have a concrete plan. So we then created our own incident response plan, are in the middle of testing it through an outside provider as well, so that we can ensure that what's on paper actually works, because it's great to have things on paper, but if you don't test them and make sure they work, and when you have a problem, it's not going to solve it. It's just a piece of paper sitting there.
All right, one more question for you then.
Okay.
So what about the risk matrix? Who was involved in that? I know you said Mark, yourself, but were there other internal and external committees that made you get comfortable with moving and getting everything up?
Yeah, so we were really mostly what was driving our risk matrix was we had to get off our trust accounting system and move to another provider. So when we were looking to see like, okay, what information is actually out there, because everything was in-house on our server internally, we then had to say like, okay, well, what information will we be putting out there that isn't currently out there? So that was a big kind of eye-opener for us, and then it was also, well, we have a lot of other things that we're using in the cloud right now that we never really thought of having our data. And so being able to then identify which provider had what information, and we drove it all the way down to like paychecks for employee information. So we really did a full scope because we wanted to see what was our top providers and what information they had and where was it hosted. Was it in the cloud or was it internal? So once we were able to come up with that internally, we then kind of, bounced it off a couple other people outside of the firm to say, like, what are you guys doing in order to kind of rank these and what? So we scaled it to a 1, 2, 3 ranking, whether they had, just client information, employee information, what information would the SEC be concerned about if it was to leak out. And then from there, we decided, okay, these are the ones we feel comfortable with, and this is the ones we do not feel comfortable with. And then based on that, now we also hired ACA to do due diligence on our top 5 vendors, and we'll expand that over time, but money constraints, we're looking at our top 5 right now. And really, we base that on who had the most information of our client data.
Great, thanks, Danielle. A lot to consider, and the real life examples are very helpful. So I just want to take a shift a little bit to Mark. You had discussed on the call the SEC risk alert, and I think if everyone's not familiar with it, maybe it'd be helpful to discuss that in the cloud storage.
Sure, absolutely. And I think a couple of things you hit on actually come directly out of that SEC regulation. So the OCIE, or the Office of Compliance and Inspector Exams, earlier this year in May, released a risk alert regarding firms like yourself moving data to the cloud. A few things of interest, which is historically the SEC tends to be very vague in terms of what their regulations are. This one, I think the language got a lot more specific, what they were looking for, number one. Two, the fact that they're actually looking at cloud, recognizing firms are moving there and addressing that also is a pretty telling point. So the 4 areas that they looked at specifically when they went out and reviewed firms and identified deficiencies, first and foremost was misconfigurations. And this plays directly into the diagram that Chip was reviewing earlier, which is when we look at the security and understanding that responsibility, it's not so much the security of the cloud where those misconfigurations are happening, it's the security in the cloud. So it's firms that are not setting up the appropriate logging, not setting up the appropriate permissions, security groups, multi-factor authentication. So it's important that all of these configurations are set correctly. Patching, so depending on, back to the previous slide, whether we're in the apartment or the condo, if we're responsible for patching, is it being done? We see obviously what happened with Equifax. So those type of misconfigurations are super important, and there was a list that they identified there. So that's number one. Number two was policies and procedures. We can't go out and configure all of these things if our firm doesn't have a policy or procedure that says, this is how we're going to audit things, this is how we're going to limit access to things and permissions. So that was the second thing. Third was really around oversight and governance with the vendor. So Danielle did a fantastic job in terms of going out to those vendors, asking the questions, doing the due diligence, building that risk matrix. So it's important that we also have the oversight to make sure that their policies are actually mapping to what your firm's policies and procedures are for information security. And then the last piece, data classification. How could I forget? I was just talking about that. So super important that we understand, for me, it really does start with the data. And then making sure that we have the appropriate permissions and security controls that govern access to how is that data being accessed, who's accessing that data, and so forth. So those are kind of the 4 key areas that the SEC is looking at when they've identified deficiencies with moving data to the cloud.
Yeah, so you hit a lot, and I think a lot of us in the room, the word control and loss of control kind of comes up as in theme here. So, Verity, what do you think about that, and who's responsible for loss?
Yeah, well, needless to say, you are responsible for the loss. You chose the vendor. It is your data. You are ultimately responsible for it. And I think that's an important distinction that a lot of people don't recognize. They just think, oh, well, I'm going to go put my data up over here at Microsoft, or it's going to be, with Salentica. They're hosting for me my CRM data. So it's their responsibility. It's not. It is ultimately yours. And you are ultimately responsible for the compliancy of that as well. So that's really what Mark was just getting into, talking about those SEC requirements. It is ultimately your responsibility. Now, I think it's important to note when people are like concerned about that loss of control moving to the cloud. It takes me back. I think back to kind of when I got into this industry. Was working in IT, and I was working at an investment firm, and there was talk about disaster recovery, and I think we had like a 2-page document, and there were some, a couple servers and a couple workstations like stashed in the IT manager's house or something. I mean, there's really no big plans for it. There were tapes being copied and backed up and taken off-site every night. And then 9/11 happened, and it just changed the industry. I think it changed the world. I think everybody really kind of woke up to this concept of what do I do if something major happens? I can't get into my office or whatever. And I think that was a big impact to the industry, to the world for probably 5 to 10 years. And I think I've actually seen people get a little bit more lax. So even though I'm saying, I just saw 2 people, 3 people doing DR testing over the last month and a half, I also can say that over the past 5 to 6 years, I've probably seen 5 or 6 people do DR tests, and I've worked with hundreds of clients. So people are not doing their due diligence in their testing. And I also think that people don't think about their data as diligently as they should when it is on premise. Because they just think, oh, well, it's locked in that closet over there, and it's just in my local network. They don't actually think and give the attention that they would when they move to the cloud. And so I almost, kind of put it on you guys that no matter if you are looking at the cloud or you are on-prem, whatever you are in between, make sure you are giving the diligence and the testing and the attention to security, no matter where you are.
So Mark, that segues into another piece for you, the DR in the cloud service. Is that included? I think just what Verity's saying, a lot of people assume that.
Yeah, I think that's the issue, right? It's, hey, I'm going to move to the cloud, and security should be all set, and disaster recovery and business continuity all set. They're handling it, and that is so far from the truth. I think it's super important that as you look at what type of cloud provider you're going to, that you ask those questions. So Daniela, as she brought up, asking those questions, getting a copy of their business continuity guide, and then making sure that as you look at your firm's business continuity guide, how do those two fit together? So if you have a particular recovery time objective on, I need to be up and running in 4 hours, what is theirs? And making sure that those map together. And back to Chris's slide earlier, again, I'm referencing the apartment and hotel. Some of those you will find that business continuity and disaster recovery services are included. Then you'll find some of those models that they're not. But I think asking those questions and then making sure that you map that to your firm's policies, and then I can't stress enough, test, and test. Yeah. We try to do it with all of our customers at least once a year. We have a few firms that will do semi-annual testing, but at least annually to do DR testing.
Great. Do you have any case studies on that? Any sort of failures of people like ignoring it and then when they go to test it?
I can't say that I have any horrific case stories, thankfully. But I think the thing that comes out of most of the disaster recovery tests is, you're going through that to identify issues. So, as you go through, it's rare that you're going to get 100, get an A+, but you can identify, hey, this application isn't able to print this report this way, or maybe we're missing something. So you go back and you tweak it. That's the whole point of the test, is to identify any shortfalls or issues, remedy those, and then retest. So usually as we go through that, I'm looking at Patrick in the back, he does a lot of these with me, but usually we're finding a handful of little things here and there, identifying those, resolving those so that it is better each time. But as you go through and you're updating systems, new versions of applications, it's critical that you're retesting your business continuity and disaster recovery plan.
That's great, thanks. So Chip, would you discuss with us, sort of in your experience, the questions that you need to be asking the different cloud providers, the risks that are involved?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of times you have a due diligence questionnaire, or what you might call DDQ, right? And if you don't, you will be doing this fairly soon, right? It's just the way the world's working. We have DoD clients, and they have to do these for all their vendors and their vendors' vendors. So it's a pretty big deal now in the industry. One of the things that you want to take a look at is normally for our clients, what we see is you might have a short version of the DDQ and you might have a long version of this questionnaire, right? The short version is you might give to a non-critical vendor, right? They don't have critical data, but they have important, or they might have access to some data. So you give this to make sure that they're doing the standard stuff, and I'll give you some examples in a minute. The longer version is for vendors that have more access to your data, maybe a marketing firm that has access to your client's information, right? This is the kind of stuff the SEC would be upset if you somehow lost or your vendor lost, right? So, and the kind of questions you have on this is, what kind of, when was the last time the vendor had a penetration test done? Or, what does their security posture look like, and what do they use for mitigation techniques? right? You want to ask these type of questions so you can understand that if they're giving kind of nothing answers, you can start to understand that, okay, they might not be ready or they might not be prepared for a real issue that they can have, right? Especially if they're a cloud vendor, they should have all this stuff at their fingertips. Now, if you're working with Salesforce or Microsoft, those are easy and they're pretty simple in that you just contact your account person there, or a lot of times online you can just download it. If you're working with a company like Thrive and you have an up-to-date agreement, we're sending you our SOC 2, right? Those are the kind of stuff that's easy and that can fill a lot of holes that you might be looking for. But for some of the smaller vendors or some of the smaller ones out there, you want to send them these questionnaires, and they're not short. I don't know if you've ever done one, but they're really long. It does give you an idea what is where their posture is security-wise. You want to do this every year. These things change, right? Companies get bought. They change locations. People change within those companies. So you want to send these questionnaires out at least yearly to make sure that you know what's going on within that organization. And one thing that I kind of want to touch a little bit on what Mark said is a lot of times when you get these questionnaires, you do them and you read through them, you then look at yourself and say, okay, I'm not doing this, as Danielle said. I might not have a disaster recovery plan or incident response plan, but also I might not have these policies and procedures in place for myself, right? So you think about moving to the cloud, and people move into AWS all the time, but then you also hear about these buckets, magical buckets in the cloud that are left unsecure, right? Well, they didn't mean to leave them unsecure, right? They didn't mean to do that, but they didn't have policies, procedures in place, or they weren't following them. So that's how this data gets out there, and you have DMV data or whatever data sitting out on the web that nobody knows about, and it's just out there, right? So these questionnaires can be really good. They're really good for your vendors, but they're also going to be very good for yourself.
That's great. Thanks, Joe. We have just a few minutes for questions. Yes.
One of the things that we've tried to take advantage of, we're fully cloud-based. We have the advantage of, we're a fairly new company. We started 4 years ago, so we didn't have a legacy platform to deal with. But one of the things we've been really pushing our vendors on and taking advantage of is centralized identity management. We happen to use the Azure platform for that, but it does two things in addressing the SEC concerns. One is it ensures that we can enforce things like MFA on login for applications, not just Microsoft applications, but our own internal applications, the applications of our vendors. The second thing it does is gives us really good logging and security risk assessments about, if we see someone trying to log in from Qatar and we don't have anyone in Qatar, that's probably a sign that someone's coming at us. I just was wondering about your thoughts on that in general, how that relates to some of the work you're doing with private cloud, for example, where that may be tougher to do, and where that centralized, and what you think the future is of that. We're down to only, I think, 2 vendors that don't support single sign-on using that approach. But it's been a push to get there, and it's been it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out in the future.
Yeah, I'll start with that. In that, I always push for single sign-on and multi-factor, right? That's just the way to go, at least in today's industry. A lot of our clients, Thrive itself does it. It makes it a lot easier, and also, as you mentioned, we push some of our clients who do use this and are in the Azure cloud or other clouds. We can alert them, especially when they're logging in. Most of the time, people travel. I find out where everybody's traveling because I always get alerts that they're in Italy or they're in France. I'm thinking, but we do get that alert, and it helps us immensely, right? That is definitely the way to go. A lot of people are hesitant to go multi-factor, but you shouldn't be. It is much, much better than it used to be. You can get things that push to your phone. You just hit accept. It just makes things easier. So if they do get your password, they still can't get in because they need to have your phone too.
Couldn't agree more. I think anything that is externally facing, absolutely multi-factor authentication on that. And I think with single sign-on and integration with identity management is crucial. And I think we're seeing it too, more and more vendors supporting that, and clearly the way things are going in that space.
Other questions?
I have a comment, John. You know, sitting in the role as a CCO, obviously I'm up at night worrying about pretty much everything. We haven't talked yet about insurance. You know, you've got stuff in a public cloud, there's basically nothing that you're gonna do to prevent anything that's gonna happen with it. No matter what policy, what procedure, anything that you do on that top level, that's you should be doing it, but you cannot fail safe everything that's gonna happen, particularly in a public cloud, or for that matter, a third party. I mean, that's just the reality. So the practical thing is to increase your cybersecurity insurance and mitigate the risk in that regard to not lose your entire business. So, you know, we all talk about it, but the reality of it is that there's nothing that really you're going to be able to do about it if something truly happens in one of these things. So, I mean, for us, that is something from day one, increased automatically.
Yeah, that's great.
I just want to add to that too. I think one thing that I've seen a lot of people start eliminating is where they're storing certain data, like specifically specific fields of information. There are certain applications where if you have a social security number or an account number, that field can actually be encrypted. So looking out for things like that, or people just have decided flat out they are no longer storing social security numbers. And they've eliminated that from their CRM applications. So just even looking out for special features like that in the applications that you're looking for, you know, also somewhat helps, you know, prevent some of those, you know, data breach concerns about getting some of that confidential data.
One other thing I wanted to add too is increasing your cybersecurity insurance is really good, and I agree with that. But if you don't have some of the things that you mentioned in the beginning if you're not doing everything you should be doing on your end, the payout might not come that you expect, right?
No, I mean, so assuming you've done everything to that point,
Yeah.
but most people here are not you. So therefore, you're gonna have to also offset it with insurance. I mean, that's the reality. We're not all CISOs. So, you know, that's my point. Absolutely, you're not gonna get that payout if you went against your practices and your policies, which that insurance company has. But I'm just trying to say that increasing your plan is not a bad idea as well, particularly as you continue to move things. Well, I don't even want to say the word as you particularly move things, because you could have the same problems as you've already said on an on-prem solution too. So just increase your insurance.
Yeah, that's a great point, Melissa. And your end user training too, to make sure they stay in the policies and procedures.
I think that's a really good point, though. A lot of people think, oh, well, moving to the cloud increases my risk and increases my chance of a data breach. I'd actually disagree. I think actually on-prem, people are not, again, as conscientious because they're, you know, behind closed doors. And a lot of times they don't put in place a lot of those safe practices to protect their data. And so it's actually at a higher risk when you have it on-prem because you're not looking at those policies and procedures.
I think one thing to add, when I think most people think of disaster recovery, they think of, you know, the sprinkler system going off or a fire, but the reality is these days, probably the higher likelihood of some sort of ransomware, some sort of crypto something coming in and getting into your environment and having to rely on that DR plan. So don't always think of DR as kind of the worst case scenario. It could be, you know, one crucial server that gets crypto lockered, or one valuable laptop in the company that gets data stolen from it. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at the business continuity disaster recovery planning as well.
There's actually an investment firm, they're not present here, but here in the Boston area, and that happened to them like 3 weeks ago. And a couple of their servers actually got ransomware affected. So and they're all locally on-prem installed. It was like user clicked on, something in their email and, just kind of spread through their network.
I just want to add a couple things too. We've talked a lot about security in the cloud, and I think everyone raised their hand. The number one reason why I haven't gone to the cloud is simply because of being concerned about security. Yet to back up your point, 81% of all breaches come in from individual end users, individual employees that click on a bad link, that go into Starbucks and click on the wrong Wi-Fi, that leave their port open, they get scanned. And those are the areas that you can all protect, whether you're in the cloud or not in the cloud. And I think, if I walk into a restaurant and hand my credit card to a waiter, I'm 12 times more likely to get hacked than every single transaction I do online. Same thing when I go to a gas station and hand the card to an attendant. So I think the many to one in the cloud, all the providers like Thrive and others are tasked with an entire staff with policies and procedures to protect everything. Yet what we find in individual organizations, parties change, IT managers change. We found a lot of even Fortune 1000 companies where they've had systems that haven't been updated in 7 years, haven't been patched, OS's security holes everywhere, because they've built out an internal IT staff, and they have systems that they have a hard time keeping up with. And then you get in those CapEx, OpEx cycles, and it sounds great that I want to be a CapEx shop, yet it may be a point in time during your business where you're going to extend that 4, 5, 6 years on a 3-year hardware cycle, and those OS patches or vulnerabilities will cause problems and issues too. So I think a lot of the operating X capital, a lot of putting everything on the cloud, a lot of having everything with a regular known entity with an SLA that protects you in disaster recovery gives you a built-in protection system that you can run your business with on a known commodity rather than kind of one by one hoping as you go along. So it's a couple things that we
Great points. Other questions? No?
I got one.
Okay.
How long does it take to move my stuff to the cloud? So you said, Danielle, you were going back saying, basically a few years. And I think that's something, just if you leave here, it is not like, all right, great, we're going to move to the cloud. Hopefully we'll have it done by the end of Q1. Putting that risk matrix together is awesome. But then looking at every application, but this is not something that is we're going to do it in 60 or 90 days. You really need to look at your entire business. Barry may have mentioned earlier, like looking at your workflows and kind of mapping all of that out. So that's super important, and it is something that does take some time, and it's not, we don't need to necessarily forklift and move everything up and move it in overnight. There are certainly phases and steps to do that, but just recognize it is not something that happens in the course of a few weeks.
And I will say we are slow moving as it is. We're 30 employees, so we don't have a ton of bandwidth, and it took us like 30 years. So it's doable, but don't think it's going to happen overnight.
You do it in phases, and I think part of that kind of mapping is also looking at not just the workflows, but when you are deciding on a specific application, you also need to look at the integration points. So that's really that big picture. You have to be looking holistically, not just, I would want to find a better reporting solution, and let's just find something that's in the cloud. Well, now you have to look at how that tool or that utility is going to integrate with your accounting system or your CRM or wherever it has to pull the data from. And now think about the security, right? And how is that data going to be exchanged with that system that might be on-prem versus one that's in the cloud, and now you have data, passing through a pipe somewhere. So really sitting down and figuring out what solutions you want to move to the cloud, what the priority is, but then also how that's going to integrate with your existing workflows is critical.
Great, thank you. Thanks to the panel and also to our first panel, Melissa and Chris on it. That concludes today's session. We have Verisoft and Thrive sticking around for about another 30 minutes. If you'd like to meet over on the side for individual questions. But thank you for attending today.